Hi, everybody, and welcome. So appreciative of everyone's time and interest in this really important topic. My name is Lance Chimka. I am Allegheny County's Economic Development Director, and it is really hard to overstate the importance of the market value analysis. This is, as you'll see, is presented by our friends at the Reinvestment Fund's really data-rich analysis and comprehensive analysis of housing markets in Allegheny County, and serves to guide affordable housing production and preservation policy in my office, but then also with for-profit, nonprofit partners, other government agencies, with all of the participants on this call. It's going to be a wide-reaching kind of document that I hope everyone's going to really use in the tough decisions and resource allocations that we all have to make. This is the county's only second one, and we always are striving for incremental improvement over the last. So the two big things I'm excited about here are, one, because it's the second point in time, we have the ability to do kind of a time series analysis, understand how some of our markets are moving, which is a really important data point. And two, probably most importantly, it's the first time we're comprehensively looking at this with the city of Pittsburgh. So we have a first kind of comprehensive view of the entire county marketplace. So really thankful for the hard work and expertise the Reinvestment Fund put in, and very thankful for continuing partnership with our friends at the URA. Now I'll kick it over to Greg at the URA for some opening comments as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lance. Yeah, we're really excited too, and we're excited by the fact that it's our first partnership with the county to see kind of a more macro level view of the city's real estate market, the regional real estate market. And I will say, as still a relative newcomer to the city, I've been here about 2 years. I find the city's real estate market, here the submarkets have submarkets. It's a really nuanced, fragmented landscape out there. It's kind of really hard to grasp unless you really delve into the data. And I think this does a really good job of doing that at a pretty granular level. And I think it's kind of obvious, but we'll state it anyway, that the purpose of this information, this data, is to help drive and inform the programs and the policies that the URA pushes out and promulgates in terms of trying to ward off against things like incipient blight, overheating markets that can cause gentrification, land speculation, and the like. And we've used previous iterations of this MVA to drive our own real estate investment strategy here at URA. So we're really excited to see how things have changed since the last time this study was done. And with that, I want to turn it over to Colin and the folks at the Reinvestment Fund to roll right into it. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ira Goldstein with Reinvestment Fund, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Colin Whitig and Elena Kim. And the three of us comprised the team that worked on this MVA, and actually some of the prior MVAs. Next slide, Colin. First, I'd like to start out by thanking the folks at the URA and Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh for all their support of this tool and the effort that went into it, as well as keeping a pretty inclusive process that allowed us to hear the voices of a number of different groups around the county and within the city to help us understand the nuances of the market that we can't necessarily see in the data, but need to be incorporated into the analysis, as well as to ensure that the MVA that we create this time is what I like to call both accurate and actionable. We pride ourselves on getting things right, but we also want to make sure that when the tool is delivered, it's a tool that really does foster the application of data and objective analytics to being able to solve the kinds of issues that that the city and county have to confront. So with that, I'd like to just quickly introduce you to Reinvestment Fund. We are a Philadelphia-based not-for-profit that is part of a body of institutions around the country that are called Community Development Financial Institutions, or CDFI. We are one of the oldest and one of the largest of that body of organizations. Technically, I think the best way to think about us is that we are a lending institution with public purpose. Over our history, we've made over $2.4 billion in loans and investments, a significant portion in southeastern Pennsylvania, but quite frankly, a very significant portion as well in southwestern Pennsylvania. We've been active out in that area, both individually and along with other CDFI partners in Southwest Pennsylvania. And we also do our lending work really in different sectors across the country. Colin and Elena and I are part of the Policy Solutions Group. We are essentially the internal research capacity of the organization. We have two bodies of things that we do, one of which is looking at the impacts of our own transactions to ensure that we're meeting the purposes and intentions and mission of our organization with each and every transaction. But then we also work with organizations like URA, like Allegheny County, who through their work are essentially involved in similar mission kind of things as we are. And, are there ways that we can bring our research capacities to ensure that, like us, Allegheny County, URA, and other entities like that have the ability to bring these kinds of data and analytics to the work to make sure that they have the greatest prospect of being impactful in the ways that they would like them to have. Next slide. Next, the MVA is a tool that we created back in Philadelphia more than 20 years ago now, and it was really a tool that was designed to help now, I think, 2 or 3 former former mayors in Philadelphia to make a set of investments that ultimately fell under the umbrella of what that mayor, John Street, called the Neighborhood Transformation Initiative. And the MVA was essentially the database framework that Mayor Street used at that time to go out and essentially sell nearly $300 million worth of bonds that were the proceeds of which were to be used to essentially begin to think about revitalizing and strengthening the neighborhoods around the city of Philadelphia that had long languished after the downtown of Philadelphia had really begun to thrive. And it was his purposes and specific intentions with that NTI program, the Neighborhood Transformation Program, Initiative Program, to make sure that that happened. This MVA was one of the ways that he was able to understand what the markets were, what the conditions were, what kinds of things might make the most sense in different parts of the city of Philadelphia, and then to invest in those things, be they programs or policies or expenditures or what have you. Since that time, we've replicated the MVA probably 50 times around the country at this point in cities as small as Selma, Alabama, entire states like the state of Delaware, regions, and I guess the largest of the places that we would have worked from a population perspective was Houston, Texas. Each one of those, quite frankly, allows us to learn some things ourselves that that we can now bring to this, the second MVA for the URA, and either the 5th or the 6th for this, second for the county, 5th or the 6th for the URA in the city of Pittsburgh, to hopefully make it a better, stronger, more impactful and efficacious tool. Next slide, please. This is the listing of places. Many of these places, like in southwestern Pennsylvania, we've done this work multiple times, which does allow for an understanding how places are changing. Next slide, please. We do have a couple of assumptions that undergird the analysis that we do, and we think it's really appropriate to be transparent about those assumptions. Firstly, oftentimes communities are thinking about the MVA as a tool that will help them distribute public subsidy in one form or another, be it governmental subsidy or philanthropic subsidy. And our our understanding and the assumption that we bring to this tool and to the analysis is that that public subsidy, no matter how big a bundle it is, and $300 million for NTI was an awful lot of money, acting alone, those subsidies can't create markets where those markets don't exist. And so that takes us to our second normative assumption, which is that that subsidy must leverage private investment, if not immediately, that there's a glide path to see that to happen, because that is the point at which we believe that markets are beginning to properly. You'll see a depiction of the Pittsburgh and Allegheny County markets that are indicative of great strength. And you'll see some at the other end of the spectrum that manifest some really serious challenges. The underlying assumption is not to avoid those places that are showing those challenges and invest in the strong and the strongest, but it's to essentially build from strength. In other words, in those challenged markets, identify nodes of strength and invest into those, be they a confluence of public transportation, a strong community-based organization, proximity to a job center, or a stronger real estate market. Whatever is identifiable as the strength in that distressed area, go into that, invest off of that node, and begin to build out. Next, we do this for an entire area, and that's because we believe that the entirety of a community, in this instance, Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh, are really the customers for the services and goods and proceeds and the like that will be invested in places to bring about positive change. And so an analysis that is focused on a single neighborhood or a single site, that's useful for some purposes. But when you're talking about sitting back at the perspective of being, the leader of the URA or of Allegheny County, your responsibility attaches to the entirety of these places. And so you need analytics that address the entirety. And the last of our assumptions, interesting how this one has changed over time, is that, in 2001, when we did the first MVA in Philadelphia, we were looking at a $300 million pot of money ultimately for community-based investments. Our notion was that those dollars ought to be invested based on this analytic set of analytics that are reflective objectively and equitably of the markets within that place. Our elected representatives thought they all ought to get an even share. And it took a lot of work to get them to understand the importance of not necessarily an even share, but an appropriate share based on the objective realities and conditions within a place. And that might mean that some areas get more, some areas get less, but each gets what it needs. I have to say that our observations over the last 20 plus years is that elected officials and administrative officials are really recognizing the importance of making these kinds of decisions based in objective and transparent data, be it quantitative or qualitative or both. And this really is, a welcome change, because we believe, as this last assumption says, that the best decisions are based in this data. And with that, I think I will stop and turn it over to my colleagues to continue on with the present. Oh, excuse me. One other slide for me to address, the MVA process. My apologies. We worked, and the folks at URA in Allegheny County worked very hard to put together a stakeholder group of local subject matter experts about different neighborhoods and communities, experts about different aspects of the real estate market. And it is that group that helped us take a look at all of this administrative data, which we clean and geocode and analyze in order to get it ready for the MVA, that this group allows us to have greater confidence in that, that the components of the MVA are in fact accurate. So in addition to the kinds of standard cleaning and the like that we do to the data, this group of people met, I think, 3 or 4 times throughout the course of this study. and really just got in and kicked the tires with us to make sure that everything was accurate. The data that we get are analyzed using a statistical cluster analysis, which takes a set of indicators, which you will see momentarily, analyzes them statistically for each of the block groups within Allegheny County. And essentially the statistical procedure sorts those block groups into strata or groupings, subgroupings that are together in a group because they share a common set of characteristics, but each group is very different from the other. So you will see, for example, in Allegheny County, a blue block group in one part of the county and a blue block group in another part of the county. What they share is a common set of characteristics. However, the blue block group is going to be different from the yellow block group or the orange block group, etc. This stakeholder group that I mentioned really does get in and sort of kick the tires on that analysis as well, ultimately helping us get to the point where we feel that we have an accurate depiction of the markets of this community, this Allegheny County community. We then take some of the suggestions of that group as to the kinds of things that they wanted to see relayed with the reinvestment, with the MVA, and allow for a more comprehensive analysis of the things that are both driving the MVA as well as the things that are essentially influenced or indicative of the MVA. Now, I think I will stop and turn it over to my colleague, Colin. Thank you.
Thanks, Ira. So one more slide that we wanted to mention before we go on to show you what the results were from the last set of MVAs is one that you can use to reference to think about, well, how do I apply this tool once I am looking at these data to my local environment. And so the MVA has been used for a whole variety of different things in different places. This slide has a bunch of different programs that have been used and the places where they've been implemented, including things like a local land banking strategy. So thinking about what are the strengths or challenges in a market and how could land banking accentuate some of those strengths. There have been things like informing low-income housing tax credit QAP. The state of Delaware, when they put out their QAP plan, wanted to incentivize LIHTC investment in particular market types. And so they awarded points on their QAP to developers that were applying to do LIHTC development in those places. And especially important, I think, especially in the climate that we all live in today, is thinking about the MVA through a fair housing lens. And so the MVA is a tool that you can use, and we'll show you some data about how race and ethnicity interact with the MVA in a little bit. And it can help you think about what are the fair housing implications for different market types throughout the geographies that you're working in. So this will be part of the presentation, so you'll be able to reference this, and we're happy to provide more information if any of these particular ideas are interesting to you about how to use the data to implement these kind of activities. Okay, before we get into the results of this most recent analysis, we thought it would be very helpful to revisit where we were the last time around, so you can get a sense of the trajectory of how the real estate market's been changing in Allegheny County and in the city of Pittsburgh, and also get a sense of why this time URA and the county decided to join their market value analyses into one analysis that categorizes all the census block groups throughout Allegheny County and within the city of Pittsburgh. These were the results from the first Allegheny County market value analysis, which we completed in 2016. The way you can read this table, if you're unfamiliar with it, is that each of those columns describes essentially an ingredient that goes into the statistical cluster analysis that Ira mentioned. So we have things that measure both the typical sale price and the variation in sale price in a block group. We look at the share of owners or renters in an area. We look at measures of investment, like where new development is happening and or where permitting investment is happening. And then we also look at some indicators of distress in the market, things like vacancy, code violations, or parcel condition. So those are the columns, those are the variables that go into the market value analysis. The rows describe the clusters that are identified by that statistical cluster analysis. So if you go across this very first row with the A cluster, you can expect that any of the block groups that are identified in the A cluster will have sale prices somewhere around that $435,000 mark. There'll be low variation, meaning that most of the sales in the area will be typically very close to that highest sale price in the county. They'll have a very high share of owner occupants and high share of investment activities, as shown by the percent of parcels that were built in the last few years in those areas. And they'll also have some of the lowest shares of the different indicators of distress in the market, like foreclosures and vacancy. When you go across, these are the typical values. You can see that there were 33 block groups in the last analysis that were described as in the A cluster. So when you look at the individual data, you'll be able to see that there'll be some variation amongst those 33 block groups, but you can be sure that what the statistical cluster analysis is doing is it's making sure that on these values, the A block groups are very different than the B or the E or the G block groups. So these are the typical values within each of the identified clusters. This is what each block group looks like across Allegheny County in the 2016 analysis. And so as Ira mentioned, when you look at, for example, one of those dark blue block groups, you'll see that they're in all different parts of the county. You'll see some out in the eastern part of the county, the southern part of the county, like near Bethel Park. There's some in Moon in the western part of the county, and then also in the northern part of the county. And even though these places are in geographically very different parts of Allegheny County, they are alike on that set of real estate market indicators that went into the analysis. And so that's why that statistical cluster analysis has grouped them together. You'll also notice that there is basically a donut hole where the city of Pittsburgh is within Allegheny County, because the last time around, the city of Pittsburgh was described in a separate market value analysis. And you can see a bit of a comparison between the two on the left and right hand side here. So you'll see that we've sort of cut down the number of indicators that we're showing here, but the full table is available for both market value analyses that were conducted in 2016. But you'll see that some of the clusters across the city and the county had a lot in common. Again, if we stick with that A cluster, you'll see that these are both areas that had some of the highest sale prices in both the city and the county. They had high shares of owner occupancy, although they were a little bit lower in the city than the county. Still, typically there were more owners than renters in these A block groups within the city. And they had low shares of foreclosure or parcels that had some building condition issues. But there were also some interesting differences, I think, last time around between the city and the county market value analyses. So if we just go to that very next cluster, the B block groups, you'll see that while the sale prices are the same, the tenure mix is very different. In the city, there was a very high share of renters in these strong B block groups. And so that was really a distinct cluster in the city that we didn't see so much in the county. I think if you look in the county, you'll see that the C block groups, which had higher than typical sale prices, and again, a high share of owner occupancy, were very different, again, than the C block groups that we found in the city. So because we had this mixture of some clusters that look quite alike, whether you were in the city and the county, whereas a few that look quite different, the decision was made that this time around, it would be helpful to put all of the block groups across the county and within the city in the same statistical cluster analysis to understand those similarities and differences within one model. I think a second really important reason about why that decision was made from last time around is that when you compared the two separately estimated market value analyses that were done in 2016, and you looked at the city-county border, you'll see that in quite a few places, markets clearly sort of flow across that border from the city and the county. So if you look at the eastern part of Pittsburgh and then into Wilkinsburg, you'll see that there's really a lot of similarities in the real estate markets as you cross that city-county border. And you see a similar thing if you're looking at the western part of the city as it goes from Sheridan into McKees Rocks. You'll see some commonalities and some differences in a small area. Other parts of the city-county border seem to act more as a hard border between the real estate markets and what's happening in the city and the county. So by putting everything within one cluster analysis, we're really able to draw out those distinctions and differences and understand where are real estate markets kind of working together across the city and the county, and where do you see real differences that might be important to how you make decisions about how you invest dollars in those places. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the 2021 market value analysis, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague Elena, who's going to walk you through all those components that went into the analysis this time.
Thanks, Colin. So yes, we're going to go through a set of maps that's going to show you spatially how the different indicators lay out over the county and within the city of Pittsburgh. So the first indicator that we use is median sales price. So we are looking at block group level from 2017 to 19, and thinking about what's the typical housing price in each block group. And here you can sort of see the outside of the county, outside of the Pittsburgh has a darker color. And we also see Eastern County, east and south of the county has a lighter color. Darker the color, it's the more expensive the housing stock is. So I'll sort of after each map, I'll linger for a couple seconds for you to be able to see which the areas that you're most interested in, and sort of to be able to see what's going on in the maps. Next slide. And the next indicator that we use is also using the sales price. What we are looking at here is essentially how widely vary the sales price is within the block group. So the darker the area, the wider the variance is. So you can sort of think about it as the areas that are darkly colored in the dark brown color are places where the housing stock has sort of housing prices all over the place, whereas lighter yellow colors show more unified level of median sales price or sales prices in the block group. Sorry. Next slide. And then the next indicator that we use is new residential parcels. To be able to see where the new parcels have been created, we compare the parcels from 2016 to parcels from 2020. And by doing that, we're able to see where the new constructions has been happening, and new parcels have been created. So we see a lot more parcels being created outside of the city. We don't really see a whole lot of hotspots, dark colored areas within the city, but we do see a lot of the parcels being created in Franklin Park and the northwest the county, and also the western areas of the county near the Pittsburgh airport. Next slide. The next one is owner occupancy. So we're essentially looking at what share of the households are actually owner occupied, and here we see that outside of the city is a lot darker than inside of the city. And as Colin talked about, when we look at inside of the city, we see a lot of the renter communities, whereas outside of the city, we are, as we see here, that we see much more owner occupied houses and owners markets. Next slide. The next indicator is subsidized units as a percentage of renter occupied units. So here we are looking at only the renter households. And what we are looking at is how the share of rental households that are using subsidy for their rental payment. So here we are seeing most of the county is really light yellow, meaning that there aren't many rental households that are using subsidy. Whereas we see it's a little hard to see within the Pittsburgh because it's very small in the map, but we're seeing downtown area and surrounding areas there and south of the city, and also north side shows a little bit more of the darker colors, and also let's see, Wilkinsburg also is showing more darker colors, meaning that there are more renter households that are using rental subsidy. Next slide. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat for a second. Oh, so there was a question about what I mean by parcel. When I mean parcel, parcel is one. Maybe Colin, do you think you might be able to explain this better than me? Explaining what parcel we mean by parcel here.
Sure. A parcel is a unit of land that is able to be sold in a transaction that gets recorded, usually at the local recorder of deeds. So often a parcel will be associated with one home if you have, say, a single family home on it, or there could be a multifamily building that sits on a parcel, but it's the basic unit of land that gets transacted. And there's really great data on the Western PA Regional Data Center web portal about individual parcels, and describes a lot of the characteristics of each. So hopefully that's helpful in understanding, but it's a basic unit of land that allows us to go from the very granular to almost down to the address level up to these census block groups that we're analyzing.
Thank you so much. Right, so here we are also looking at the residential parcels. So when we're talking about parcels, there are commercial parcels and other land use. And here we're only looking at residential parcels, meaning parcels where there are that are being occupied by households for residential purposes. So here we're also talking about the share of parcels that are recorded as having poor or worse condition. So this is essentially an indicator of distress. And we're looking at the darker colors, meaning higher share of residential parcels being recorded as having poor or worse condition properties. Whereas the lighter color areas, which we see in the majority of areas of the county, are places where not many, if you see in the legend, 0 to 1%, very little share of residential parcels are being seen as poor, having poor or worse conditions. Next slide. And then this is a similar indicator of distress. We are looking at the housing inspection violation. Also, we are looking at, so we're seeing that darker colors, meaning the large share of residential parcels or residential properties are reported for housing inspection violation. Here we're not seeing a whole lot of the darker colors. We see a little bit in the right outside of the city on the western part of the city of Pittsburgh. And we are also seeing a little bit in the center of Pittsburgh, city of Pittsburgh, and a little bit in Wilkinsburg, but not a whole lot in the other parts of the county. Next slide. And this is looking at vacancy. So we're also looking at what is the share of residential parcels that are vacant. And here we're not seeing a whole lot of vacancy within the city of Pittsburgh, but we do see quite a bit of vacancy around south part of the county, where the darker colors mean anywhere from 15% to 41%, so nearly half of the residential parcels being vacant. Next slide. And lastly, the last indicator that we put in our cluster analysis is mortgage foreclosures. So it's a share. So because it's a mortgage indicator, we're only looking at owner-occupied households and what's the share of those owner-occupied households that have experienced mortgage foreclosures. The darkest color means there are more than 4% of the owner-occupied households that have gone through mortgage foreclosures. We don't really see a whole lot in different parts of the county. We see a little bit darker colors in Wilkinsburg area, west part of the city of Pittsburgh, as well as McKeesport area in the south of the county. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Colin again, who's going to go over the analysis results, cluster analysis results from this round of market value analysis.
Thanks, Elena. So each of those different components that Elena just described and walked through the maps of is represented on this table, again, on the columns that you see along the top here in blue. And this table works like the table we looked at a little bit earlier, where this describes each of the clusters that were identified by the statistical cluster analysis in this most recent market value analysis. And this time around, the statistical cluster analysis identified 10 distinct clusters, which was a little bit of an increase compared to the 9 clusters that were identified both in Allegheny and the city of Pittsburgh when we last did this work. When you're looking at the typical values for each of the clusters, as you go across the rows, you can compare it to this bottom row that has the average block group value across the county. So that'll give you a reference point to what a typical value for a census block group in the county would be. Again, the unit of analysis that we're using is the census block group, because that is a unit of analysis that's small enough that we feel it really captures well the changes you can see in a real estate market when you go just across the street or in a very short area. So each of these describes the typical block group in one of these clusters. Here's a map of how the clusters are distributed geographically across the county and within the city of Pittsburgh. So just as a reminder, when you look at, for example, those dark green block groups, you'll see some within the city and some just outside the city. And then a few a little bit further west on the map, like near the imperial marker. Those are all places that were identified as having similar characteristics by the cluster analysis across all those different things that Elena just showed you maps of. So you can expect that when you see something that's in one of those dark green colors, that it'll be very similar to another dark green that's in a completely different part of the county, but it'll be distinct amongst all those sets of things like sale prices, investment activity, residential distress, than, for example, one of the red block groups or the orange block groups. I'm going to walk through each of these color groupings so that you can see what distinguished each of the clusters, and also so that you can understand where geographically each of the clusters is throughout the city. Oh, before I do that, here's a close-up of the city of Pittsburgh, so you can see with a little bit finer detail what the cluster analysis results look like within the city, and how that city-county border influences where real estate markets are aligned. All this data is also going up on WPRDC's data portal, so it can be a lot of information to absorb these maps and the table. There's quite a lot of data within them, so you'll be able to pull the table and look at it next to the map so that you can really align and understand. If you're looking at a particular area and you're pulling out, I'm really interested in this light blue block group in this area, you can go across the table and understand what exactly are the typical values in these light blue places. So the first set of markets we're going to take a look at are these dark purple markets, or the A markets. These are areas of the city and county that have the highest sale prices. They still have very high shares of homeownership at almost 4 homeowner households for every renter household. These are areas that have very high shares of new construction activity. And they have low shares of things like building violations and foreclosures that might evidence some either building distress or some financial distress for homeowners in that area. These are the B and C block groups in the county. One other thing I think I might have neglected to mention is that if you look at the first column, it'll tell you the number of block groups that were identified in each of these clusters. And what you'll see for these B and C block groups is that you have about 300 block groups out of about 1,100 across the county. And so this is one of really the predominant market types across Allegheny County and also within the city of Pittsburgh. These are areas that have higher than average sale prices. There's a 10-year mix in that the dark blue block groups are a little bit more renter occupied than owner occupied, but the light blue block groups are those that have the highest share of homeowners across the city and the county. So you can expect about 9 homeowners for every renter household in those areas. These B block groups, which are in that darker blue, are also experiencing higher than average new construction activity. And each has lower numbers on those distress indicators that we talked about, very low numbers of poor or worse condition parcels, lower than typical building violations, and not much vacant lot area. The next set of markets that we're going to look at are these green markets. These also have a high share across the city and the county. They're places that typically have sale prices very close to the county average. There's, again, a differential here where your dark markets are those that have a mix of homeowners and renters, maybe a few more renters than homeowners, whereas the light green markets are going to have high shares of homeowners compared to renters. Starting to see a little bit more subsidized rental activity than you saw in those A, B, and C markets. So there are some renters that are able to use some kind of federal subsidy to access the rental market in these places, although still less than is typical across the city or Allegheny County. There isn't as much new construction activity as we saw in those A, B, and C markets, but there's also generally lower shares of building condition issues and about typical shares of homeowners that are experiencing a foreclosure filing. One market type that I think is unique compared to the last time that we did this work is this F market type, which is in the red color. It's a market type that has a very high share of renters that are using some kind of federal subsidy. So they might be renter households that are using housing choice voucher. They might live in a low income housing tax credit development or a public housing development. And interestingly, you see these markets all throughout both the county and the city, really in a variety of different places geographically, which is a good sign that people who are using some form of federal subsidy are able to access different parts of the city and the county and the opportunities that might be available to them in those different places. The sales prices for the homeowners that do live in these areas are just a little bit below what's typical for the county average. There is a little bit higher building condition and vacant lot area issues in these areas. So that's one thing that you might want to keep an eye on because right now these are places that really provide some opportunity for people who are accessing them with subsidized rental activity. The next set of markets is the G and H markets in orange. These are places that have lower than the typical Allegheny County sale price. And you also see that that coefficient of variance is going up. It's higher than the county average. So they have lower than typical sale prices, but there's also a lot of variation in the sale price in these areas. So you might really see a mixture of homes that are selling around $70,000, but you might see some that are, well above $100,000 and some that are below that $70,000 mark as well. There's typically more homeowners than renters in these areas. These are also areas where people are accessing subsidized rental opportunities. And in these areas, you start to see those building condition issues start to tick up. So you see a little bit higher, poor or worse condition parcels in those H markets, as well as building violations. And the foreclosure activity is a little bit higher in these areas than across the county. And these are the yellow markets that were identified by the statistical cluster analysis. These are places that have a little bit lower share of homeowners than renters. The I or lighter yellow markets are also markets that have a high share of subsidized renters that live within them. And some of these markets have some building condition, higher readings on those building condition variables than we've seen in other places. So you'll see those poor or worse condition parcels are higher here than we've seen in some of the other market types that we've looked through. So this table goes through the race and ethnicity of occupants of each of the different market types that we just looked at. Each of the percentages is a row percentage, so it shows the share of each race or ethnicity within each market type. And then final column shows what the average typical median household income is for across all the block groups. This is another table that has a lot of information, so I'm going to go to the next table, which summarizes this a little bit more in a chart form, might be a little bit more digestible, where it shows for each census race or ethnicity, it shows the share of Allegheny County residents who identify as that race or as that ethnicity, and which of the market types that those people live in. So you'll see that there are definite racial disparities evidenced by this table. For example, Asian and white residents are more likely to live in the purple or the blue markets, where Black or Hispanic residents are more likely to live in those red-orange markets or the yellow markets. Another interesting fact on this table is that you'll see in those green markets, which are those middle markets that have solid housing values and generally low levels of housing distress, there's real diversity in those markets of people of all different races and ethnicities live in those markets. So those are important places for both the city and the county to consider, because they provide opportunities for people of all races and ethnicities. So that's how the market value analysis looked in 2020 and 2021. I wanted to talk a little bit about how have things changed since last time around. One of the consistent changes that we saw across both the city and the county is really strong appreciation in every market type in the home sale values. So this is both a map and a table that shows you the change at a block group level and for each of the different clusters that was identified last time around in the home sale values. In this case, for the table, we're looking at the clusters that were identified last time in the Allegheny County market value analysis, but in a second, I'll show you the same table for the city of Pittsburgh's market value analysis. On the map, you'll see at a block group level how home sale prices have changed. The darker areas are those where you're seeing 30 or 50 or even 75% or more increase in the local home sale values since we last did this work, which covered home sales from 2013, 14, and 15. So those are places that are, last time we were doing this work, they were just starting to recover, I think, from the recession in 8, 9, and 10. And now you're really seeing strong housing price appreciation in those places. Conversely, those gray areas are those where sale prices have gone down a little bit. And there's really few of those areas across both the city and the county. if you look at it across the different market types, interestingly, the market types that had lower sale prices last time around have been those that have experienced the highest appreciation between that 2016 analysis and this most recent analysis. So you'll see that, for example, in the G and H markets, you had 36% sales price appreciation in those areas. And in the I markets, you have, almost 90% sales price appreciation in those areas. Also, importantly, every market type is moving in the right direction. Here's that same information comparing the city of Pittsburgh from last time around to this time. We saw a pretty similar pattern in that every market type has been increasing from the last time we did this analysis to this time. And again, generally those G, H, and I markets had the strongest increases, with one exception, which was that last time around, there was these E markets, which you'll especially see in the eastern part of the city, in the Lawrenceville area, for example, that really had strong, almost 100% sales price appreciation from the last time we did this analysis to now. And you'll see on the map that those areas are all shaded in a very concentrated area in that highest shade, because the sale prices have really increased quite a bit there from the last time we did this analysis. But they're not the only areas in the city of Pittsburgh that have seen strong sales price appreciation. We also see strong sales price appreciation on north side and in some places in the south side of the city as well. When thinking about how the market value analysis itself has changed from the last time around to this time, this map identifies places that have shifted up a market value analysis category. You can think of that as, say, moving from that green color into a blue color, or from the orange color, also into a green or blue color. And also areas that have moved down one of those color groupings from last time. I think the good news is that we saw 3 block groups move up for every block group that moved down from the last time around. The block groups that moved up are highlighted here in blue. You'll see that oftentimes those block groups are contiguous with each other, meaning that you'll see areas that quite a bit of the area all sort of rose in the market value analysis category over the same time period. Whereas the red areas seem to be somewhat scattered. It's a little bit more difficult to put your finger on exactly what might have happened in those places, or whether you're just seeing more fluctuation in those places than in other places. Here we're zooming in on the city of Pittsburgh. And not surprisingly, that Lawrenceville area that had the really strong price appreciation is one that's also seen almost universal moves up from the last time we did the market value analysis. And quite a few places within the eastern part of the city have seen real changes for a whole series of block groups in areas around that eastern part of the city. Also on north side, you see quite a few block groups that have been moving up since the last time we did this work. Okay, I'm going to pass this back to Elena. She's going to talk a little bit about how, once you have this market value analysis data, how you can use some other data to better understand different things that are going on in the residential real estate market.
Great, thanks, Colin. So the first overlay, additional indicator that we're going to look at is affordability. So here's the map shows a few things about affordability for households earning 120% of the median income. If you're earning 120% of the county median income, the areas colored in brown and olive color, olive with this cross-hatching, have median home sales price that exceeds 3 times of your income, and therefore are likely unaffordable for you. That's the threshold we are using, 3 times of your income for the home sales price. So the brown areas show the areas that were unaffordable back in 2016 when we did the previous round of analysis, and those areas remain unaffordable. Whereas the olive colors with the cross-hatching, in the legend, it says nearly unaffordable at 120%. Those are the areas that became newly unaffordable since 2016. So the areas hatched in blue are areas that were unaffordable in 2016, but since became affordable. And we only see about a handful of these places, mostly in light blue C markets, if you see around the county. Looking at this map, we see that essentially all of the A and B markets are unaffordable for those earning 120% of the county median income. As you see, they are obscured by the brown and olive colors. But we have many of the light blue C markets and green markets, as well as the rest of the lower markets shown as affordable here. Next slide. And then here's the next slide. We're looking at what's affordable for people at 80% of the county median income. So if you're earning 80% of the county median income, where are the areas that you can afford to buy a home? So here we're seeing a lot more areas being covered by the brown and olive color. And we see mostly the areas that are affordable for for someone who's earning 80% of the county median income are E markets and below F, G, H, I, and J markets. We don't really see A, B, and C, or even D markets really being affordable for those earning 80%. Next slide. And then even at 50%, it gets much tighter. We see most of the county and lots of the places within the city are now colored in brown or olive color, meaning that they are unaffordable for those earning 50% of county median income. And what we are really seeing is those lower markets, not even much of an F, but a little bit of F, G, H, and I, and J markets. Those are the markets that are remaining affordable for those earning 50% of county median income. Next slide. And here we're just zooming into the Pittsburgh area, back to 120% of city median income. We see that, as we saw largely in the county, the A and B markets are mostly not affordable for those earning 120% of city median income here. What are available are C and C, D, and markets that are below those markets. Next slide. So at the 80% of city median income, that we are also seeing that more markets are becoming unaffordable for those people. And we see mostly E markets and F, G, H, I, and J markets are what's affordable for those earning 80% of city median income. Next slide. And again, and 50% of city median income, we see that many of the areas just overall are unaffordable for those. What's really left is more of a distressed market, F, G, H, I, and J markets, not many F markets either, that we are seeing those areas just remaining affordable for those earning 50% of city median income. Next slide. So one of the analysis of interest we heard from the previous meetings was about neighborhood turnover. So essentially asking where are the places that new residents make up the majority of all households. One way to look at that is to find the areas where more than 50% of the households have moved into their homes since 2010. And those areas are crosshatched here in blue. So, and we overlay that on top of the MVA. And these are areas that make up about a quarter of the block groups in the entire county. So we see that some of the weaker markets are included here, but the majority of the crosshatched areas are in stronger markets that are in purple and blues. Stronger markets like A, B, C, and D markets, while unaffordable to many in the county, as we saw in the affordability maps in the previous slides, they were where many people have recently moved into. Next slide. So this pattern kind of comes through also strongly in Pittsburgh as well. We see that areas like downtown, Lower North Side, university areas and Highland Park areas have high household turnover rates. This tells us that many of those living in purple and blue markets are newer residents, and this aligns with those markets' high level of new construction we saw earlier, the new parcels. Also around Northeast Pittsburgh, around the cemetery and south of Highland Park is where Colin described earlier as where market has improved since the last MVAs. So we are seeing that these neighborhoods have not only a high number of newly moved in households and new constructions, but these are also where the housing markets have also improved since 2016, the last time we did the MVA. Now I should also note with this overlay that this is including all households, meaning that it's including rental households. So when we see areas in dark blue or B markets or dark green, which is D markets, those are renters markets, which has high percentage of renters. So that could also be driving the large percentage of recent move-ins, as we know that they move around much more frequently than the owners would. But we also see some of the strong homeowners markets like A or C or E markets that are also included here with the cross-hatching of blue color. Next slide. So the last one that we are going to look at is the mortgage lending activity. So we can look at mortgage lending activity to see how access to home mortgage credit may vary across market types. To do this, we utilize Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data to see not only what percentage of home purchase mortgage apps were approved in each market groupings, but also we can estimate how much of the home sales that happened between 2017 and 2019 had access to home mortgage credit. So from 2017 to 2019, we can see that if you see the left table under on the row of the bottom row that says all markets under the column sales 2017 to 2019. Actually the total app, the column under total app, we see that over 53,000 home purchase applications were filed in Allegheny County, and countywide 80% of applications were approved, but approval and denial rates vary considerably between market types. So for instance, if we see in blue and purple and blue markets, the first two rows, if you go to the last column of the left table, purchase loans as percent of sales, you see that over 80% of all the applications were approved, but only 5% of the applications were rejected. In yellow markets, if you see I and J markets, only 66% of the applications were approved and 20% were rejected. Comparing the number of approved apps and the number of home sales in the same period, we see that only about 16% of the home purchases in the county did not have the mortgage, and these are mostly happening in the orange and yellow markets. In purple and blue markets, most of the home sales had a mortgage. If you see that it's over 95%, whereas only 21% had access to mortgage in yellow markets. The right side table is showing the refinance application outcomes. Refinance loans also show similar pattern for approval and denial rates to home purchase loans. In purple and blue markets, refinance applications were approved at 68% and 65% rate, while only about half of those applications in the orange markets were approved. We see 54% there. And a third of the applications in the yellow markets were approved. We see about 33%. Next slide. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Colin so we can go ahead with the Q&A.
Thanks, Elena. So that was
Hey,
quite a
Colin,
bit
if I
of
may-
data. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
If I may cut in, we're going to tackle the Q&A first because we've received numerous questions through there. And if time allows, we'll switch over to live questions. Sorry for cutting in there, Colin. I think I made you lose your train of thought.
No problem, Daniel. I appreciate it. So will you raise any Q&A to us? Is that how the
Yes,
next
so
step?
we have about 18 questions here. If the questions are similar, I may combine them to try to get as many questions answered as possible. The first question we have is from Robert Damewood. Does using a combined MVA for the city and county result in a different picture of city market values? Robert cites that he expected the Lawrenceville neighborhoods to look bluer than they showed up on the map, and if that is a result of combining the city and county MVAs. And he's also interested in this topic in terms of its implications for a citywide inclusive zoning policy in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think part of what might be happening there is that those areas have higher shares of renter occupants. And so that might have been why they clustered with that blue grouping. Whereas I think the purple grouping has a very high share of homeowners. We did another analysis that was part of the MVA that we haven't shown here, which is called the displacement risk ratio analysis, which is something that highlights in particular what is going on in markets that are changing quite rapidly in terms of their sale prices. And I believe that data is going to be available as well. So that might be something that you'd be interested in looking at when you're thinking about places where the real estate market is changing quite rapidly and what's a good way to capture that with data.
Okay. The next several questions, or I'm going to combine a couple questions here. They relate to the inspection data. Amanda Settlemeyer asked, how did the team acquire the housing inspection data? A similar question is sort of who is reporting these poor housing conditions? How are we getting information on poor housing conditions in terms of, is it coming through the inspections and wherever we got that data from?
Sure. So the housing inspection data is available on the WPRDC portal. And Elena, I know you worked mostly on that. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say about the availability of that data or how you looked at it.
No, I think, yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward to be able to download from the website. I don't have anything else to say about that.
Okay. Yeah, and there's great
This is
information
Casa.
on the website about. Sorry.
Colin, I was gonna say, this is Casa, and guys, it's under the building conditions on from the real estate website, which is on the WPRDC. And I was personally highly suspicious of the validity of that data, but with pretty robust field checking, especially during the 2016 study when site visits were more allowable, it was actually pretty on point, surprisingly to me, and as might be surprising to some of you, as I see in the Q&A.
Cassandra, following that line of thought, do you think that this inspection data could in any way be like sort of skewed one way or the other because people are afraid of reporting problems such that they might lose their voucher or be forced to move? And do you think, like, for example, if a smaller community has less of an inspection capacity, might that also skew the data?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't believe the data is based on inspection data from the municipalities, and I don't believe it's based on reporting. It's just what is done as part of the Office of Property assessments of, condition and value of homes. So I doubt they get that granular, but I can't say for absolutely certain.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Casa. Thank you for that. So there were a couple of questions related to individual municipal capacity for robust inspections. Because this is assessment level data, which is typically visual inspection at time of assessment valuation, that is a moot point, right? Now it does beg the question about how granular these inspections are, which, it's not individual complaints, but it is a visual inspection from the assessor's office. So that should answer a couple questions all in one.
Okay, the next question I have here is from Aneta Avila, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. Is there a significance to the 3-year period between this MVA and the last one?
Yes, we generally try and wait 3 years in between market value analyses, just for enough time for statistical reliability in the real estate market, so that changes that you see are robust. They're not just year-to-year fluctuations, and so that we have a nice range of sales to use for our sales indicators, as well as the investment indicators, which tend to take a little bit longer. You need to look at that over a 3 to 5 year period to really see where that investment is happening in a statistically reliable way. So we generally aim for about every 3 years for market value analyses for that reason.
Okay. Similar question. This is from a user called Neighborhood Development. What methodology does this MVA use to define cluster in your analysis?
We use a statistical cluster analysis, specifically a k-means cluster analysis. And so each of those different variables that we walk through goes into the statistical cluster analysis. And then there's a variety of diagnostics and different ways of looking at the cluster results to understand, which are working well or not. And then we review it with the steering committee to make sure that, the results of the statistical analysis are matching what stakeholders on the ground understand about the residential real estate market. So it's not just, a statistical picture, but it's also a ground truth reality of what's going on in the real estate market. But the specific methodology is a k-means cluster analysis, if that's the detail that you're looking for.
Okay, this next question comes from Andrea Levin-Kosis. Does the MVA look at the length of time homes sit on the market before sale to help judge demand for certain areas? She cites an example of, a multi-million-dollar home in the city Squirrel Hills neighborhood being on the market for a long time, but ultimately selling at a high price.
We don't look at that data. It's difficult usually for us to access that data. Generally, that's something that like a multiple listing service would have, and therefore it's proprietary data that usually we're not able to access. I do think that's an interesting supplement that you might look at when you're using this data. If you're looking at, a very granular way at a block or a particular block group, you might try and access some Zillow data or some MLS data to see those sorts of things and think about how that affects the overall picture when you're looking like really specifically with the MVA data in a particular place. But we weren't able to use that because generally that data is proprietary.
This next question also comes from Andrea. There is a lot of variation in some of these numbers. Would median be something we'd want to look into in addition to average?
So for the sales price numbers, we are looking at medians. And then for that reason, we also include the coefficient of variation so that you're looking both at what is the typical sales price in a block group, but also how much variation is there around those typical sale prices. So I think for the averages, maybe you're talking about the table where we summarize each of the clusters by the average value on each of the indicators. So for those are typical values for each of the block groups, but all the data will be released as a shapefile. So you'll be able to look specifically at how close in any place you're interested in, does that number align with the number that's on the table, and see how much variation there might be in some of those numbers. But usually we use median because it's robust to some skewness in the data, like you're mentioning.
Okay, this next question comes from Tiffany Tolton. What percentage of relatively higher wealth Black residents live in orange and yellow markets, if we have that data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not aware of where you can get really granular wealth data at a block group level like that. But that would be a fascinating thing to know. I don't know, I might pass it over to Ira and see if, do you know any wealth data that's available like that, Ira, that we could look at?
There isn't a great source of geographically granular wealth data that we need to be able to do that. However, what we could do is look at income by racial grouping within those market types, and that might be a little more instructive about the nature of the mixture of people within each of the different market types. So appreciate the suggestion. We can't quite get it perfectly, but we can get a little bit closer by looking at income by race.
Okay, this is more of a clarifying question from Brian Knight about the data. To be clear, what was the percent change in housing price for different block? Sorry, I misspoke. To be clear, was the percentage change in housing price for different block groups calculated using the block groups from the previous MVA?
Yes, yeah, those are all block group level changes that we were looking at. So we're taking the median from this time, minus the median from last time, divided by the median from last time. So yeah, that's how it was calculated at a block group level, rather than like a property level, or I'm not sure what the other alternative would be.
Okay. This question is from Robert Damewood. For this data, do we have something analogous to AMI levels in, we often talk about affordability in terms of percentage of area median income. So with the various market categories, for lack of a better word, is there like something in, is there similar data available in terms of area median income levels?
That's partly what we were trying to capture with those maps that Elena showed, where we were using either the county median income from the American Community Survey or the city median income, and comparing those to the median home sale price for each of the block groups as a sort of indicator on those maps of whether, for someone who had, say, 80% of the city typical median income, would they be able to afford the typical home sale in each block group. You could do a more like refined analysis where you pulled the AMI either for the metro area. That's a common way to look at AMI, or looked at the HUD data, which will give you, for different household sizes, what the AMI is. But the maps were trying to be sort of a consolidated indicator of what was going on when you compare income to home sale price in any given area.
If I could add, if that AMI cut is uniquely useful for the folks in the city or the county, we can create a metric that approximates that for consistent household size across the region. Let's say family of 4 or whatever, be a good sort of center point for that, and then recast those maps. What I would say is that using it as your frequently sort of 80% of AMI or 50% of AMI, those AMIs tend to be higher than the city medians and and really tracked in block group medians. So what it probably would do is show a little bit less affordability than we observe in the sort of progression through those maps. But if that AMI cut is uniquely useful to the folks in the city and the county, we can sort of pull that in some, for maybe a household size, and then you'll be able to make that estimation.
One thing we've done occasionally that I think maybe would be helpful for that question is to look at the one-person household and then the four-person household. So you have both probably a one-income earner household and maybe a two-income earner household, just to show a little bit of differentiation there. And then for each of the market types, we can show the percentage of sales that would be affordable to folks with those income levels. And as Ira mentioned, either we could use AMI, or if you'd rather use a more local measure to the city or the county, we could do that way too.
Okay. Next question is from Philip Wu. How did you determine the poor or worse condition properties? Is that from the Allegheny County assessment ratings of A+ to F, or another method?
It is from the Allegheny County assessment rankings. I think they go from A+ to F. There's a number category, and the way we determined that was we counted any parcel that was in very poor or unsound condition. And then for the poor condition properties, we also added in tax delinquency data, and they were only counted towards that measure if they were 3 years or more tax delinquent, because when we originally validated that data, we found that the unsound and very poor condition properties were very reliable as we drove around and went point to point. I think as Casa was mentioning as well. But the poor were a little bit more variable. And when you joined it with that tax delinquency data, it really firmed up that indicator and made it more reliable.
Bob Grada dropped a link to more information on property assessments and the condition scoring. So thank you, Bob, for that. Anyone's interested in that topic can take a look.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
A question that keeps coming up. Will this presentation be available after we close up today, and where will it be available?
Yes, it'll be available on the WPRDC portal. I'm sure, Daniel, are you planning to send a link around to the participants, or I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, but in any case, you can go to the portal and you'll be able to search for the presentation there and the data that underlies it.
I was going to link that information in the YouTube video of this presentation that will be available on our YouTube channel, the URA's YouTube channel.
Okay. Great. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Which is to say, we'll also have a video of it. This next question comes from Ed Nusser. There's a legitimate issue with the age of data here. I know we're working with data through 2019, but is this market value analysis still relevant given the sort of tumult in the market over the past 2 years?
Yeah, I think it's important for you to be able to check some data and see how things have changed since this market value analysis as well. Sales data is publicly available in Pittsburgh, which is really helpful, and across Allegheny County, which is helpful to measure. You know, I think what this will ultimately be is it'll have you a really great picture of what things were like right before COVID hit. And then the next time that we do this work, you'll have a picture of like what happened during COVID. And you know, what's happened during COVID is still settling out. Real estate markets have been extremely variable over the past 18 months. So it might even be too early to draw any firm conclusions about the trajectory of the real estate market since COVID. But I think this is going to be really helpful, reliable data that shows you exactly where Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh were as you went into this, you know, world-changing moment. And then there's some data that you can track in the meantime that will help you understand how things are changing as things continue to evolve.
Okay, this question comes from Nathan Wetzel. is there a way to see if move-ins exclude people moving within a given area rather than moving in from elsewhere in the county or another town?
I don't, so I don't think that we are able to do distinguish that with the data that's given to us or that's available to us. We are only being able to see that households that moved into that specific household or that specific unit since 2010.
Okay, a similar line of questioning from Swain Uber, who counts as a recent move-in? Does it include only people who have moved in from outside the region, or does it also include intra-regional moves, i.e. city, county, county, city, that type of move?
Right. We are unable to know the origin of the people's move. We are only being able to sort of count or talk about where people moved to and when people moved into their current household since 2010, using the data that we have available.
Just a moment here. This next question is from Brandon Guy. How does the percent of all residents moving in dovetail with the delivery of new housing units that is reflected in the data? i.e., does the data differentiate between high turnover in existing inventory versus new residents moving into new units?
That's an interesting question. But we are not able to discuss that type of distinguish that type of different move-ins because we are only looking at the data that's available to us. That's simply looking at where people moved into since 2010.
And basically that work is based off of American Community Survey data, and that tells you where somebody was several years ago. And that's what we're working from, but it does not, it tells you if you're if they're new to that place, but it doesn't tell you where they started from. So that kind of granular, somebody moved from, one part of Pittsburgh to another, or one part of the county to another, that is just not knowable given the detail that's available inside of the American Community Survey data.
There are some other data sets available, like U-Haul publishes like one-way moves and things like that. You can start to kind of nip around the edges of this. There seem to be a lot of questions about, knowing what population is moving. So there are some other data sets out there.
Yeah. And I believe, Lance, some people have been using like credit data to be able to do that. So, where, people have credit cards and where they've been moving around from. So that's another possibility, but we did not have access to that for that particular slide that's subject to the question.
Noting the time, we have time for one more question, and this question comes from Brandon Guy. Can you characterize the skewness of median home sales prices in the data? He's asking this question because median numbers for some areas were lower than he expected.
So the coefficient of variation is going to take the skewness into account because the average is part of the calculation in the coefficient of variation. So that'll give you a sense of how much, if what you're looking for is how much variation there is in a given place in the home sale prices, that's the measure that you want to look at, is that variation.
And you'll typically find much higher variation in the lower valuated markets.
Yes, typically that's very much the case. And also typically in places that are changing quite quickly, you're going to see a lot of variation in those places as well.
Okay. Well, that's it for questions. Any closing remarks?
On behalf of the team, I just want to say thank you to everybody that tuned in today and for all your great questions. Really helpful. And we also want to say thank you to the county and to URA for being great partners throughout this work, and especially all the people that participated in all the stakeholder meetings that Ira mentioned at the beginning. Their feedback was really invaluable to this whole process, and especially this year where it's people who participated in this process before know we like to travel to Allegheny County and Pittsburgh and drive around so that we can ground truth the data, but that wasn't available to us because of COVID. So the stakeholders just were really fantastic this time around and being able to ground truth everything that we put together as part of this market value analysis. And we really appreciate their time and feedback. Ira, was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, that's well said, Colin. The stakeholders really dug in this time in a way, I think, that was just really appreciated. And as Colin said, ordinarily we're doing a lot of field work. COVID made that impossible. And we were able to give stakeholders interactive mapping capacity in a way to sort of look at very specific neighborhoods and parcels and all kinds of other things like that, which was great because they could look at it and validate the places that they knew best. So a huge debt of gratitude to the stakeholders, and of course, obviously to URA and to the county.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to the whole team. And there are a lot of questions. This is just data, right? And we need, the reason why this is a public document and the reason why there's such robust stakeholder engagement is we need your help analyzing this at your local neighborhood level to understand what this means and get some more nuance out of this. So appreciate everyone's insight and your dedication to dig into this future, and one, help us understand these findings, and two, help us improve the process in future MVAs.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Have a good rest of your day and happy holidays.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you. Happy holidays.